The transport ship Perdition's Gate shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its hull groaning like a dying beast. In the cargo hold, chained to a rusted bulkhead, Marcus Chen felt the familiar knot of despair tighten in his chest. 3 months since the fall of New Singapore. 3 months since he'd watched his daughter's school explode in a cascade of plasma fire. 3 months since everything that made him human had been stripped away, leaving only this hollow shell of rage and grief. Processing complete, announced the synthetic voice that had haunted his nightmares. Cargo delivery to Nexus Prime Arena successful. All specimens accounted for. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to remember Sarah's laugh, the way she scrunched her nose when concentrating on her homework. But the memory felt distant, filtered through layers of trauma and the mind-numbing drugs they'd pumped into him during transport. The cargo bay doors hissed open, flooding the space with alien light. Through the haze of industrial fog, Marcus saw them, his captors, the hegemony forces that had crushed humanity's colonial expansion in a war that lasted barely 6 months. The Kythera stood 9 feet tall, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming like black steel, compound eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. Behind them, smaller figures moved with predatory grace, Vex hunters, their scaled skin shifting colors with each heartbeat, faces hidden behind biomechanical masks that filtered the oxygen-rich atmosphere they couldn't breathe. "Move, meet," growled one of the Kythera, in heavily accented standard. The translation implant behind Marcus's ear burned as it processed the alien dialect. A shock prod jabbed into his ribs, sending lightning through his nervous system. Marcus stumbled forward with the other prisoners, what remained of the 47th Colonial Defense Regiment. 12 men and women who'd somehow survived the orbital bombardment of Kepler 442b, only to be rounded up like livestock for purposes unknown. They'd learned the truth during the long journey through hyperspace, the hegemony's entertainment industry, the Nexus Prime Arena. As they shuffled through sterile corridors lined with viewing ports, Marcus caught glimpses of the station's interior, a massive hollow sphere kilometers in diameter, its inner surface dotted with millions of lights. Cities, he realized. Entire civilizations built into the shell of this artificial world, all centered around the dark void at its heart where unimaginable horrors played out for the amusement of countless alien species. Magnificent, isn't it? The voice came from beside him, startling Marcus from his observations. He turned to see Dr. Elena Vasquez, the regiment's chief medical officer, her usually pristine uniform now torn and stained. Despite everything, she maintained that professional composure that had kept them all sane during the worst moments of the war. "It's an abomination," Marcus whispered back, earning another shock prod jab from their guards. Elena's laugh was bitter. "No, Marcus. It's business. The hegemony learned long ago that conquered populations make better entertainment than corpses. Why waste potential profit on genocide when you can extract decades of revenue from gladiatorial combat?" They entered a vast processing facility where hundreds of beings from dozens of species stood in designated areas, all bearing the same hollow look of the condemned. Marcus recognized some from intelligence briefings, the 6-armed Jakari with their crystalline skin, the massive Gorlani whose rocky hides could deflect small arms fire, the ethereal knight whose translucent bodies pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. All of them warriors from species that had dared to resist the hegemony's expansion. All of them defeated. A Vex administrator approached their group, its mask hissing as internal filters recycled the atmosphere. When it spoke, the voice was artificially modulated, neither male nor female, but something coldly alien. "Humans. Designation, Terran Colonial Defense Regiment 47. Combat assessment indicates moderate tactical capability, superior endurance, notable psychological resilience." The creature's head tilted at an unnatural angle. Unusual. Most species break during initial processing. You maintain unit cohesion despite inevitable termination. Sergeant Rodriguez, their squad leader, stepped forward. "What do you want with us?" "Entertainment. The arena masters have reviewed footage of your species' final stand at New Singapore. Very spirited. The betting pools are already calculating odds for your survival duration." The Vex gestured toward a bank of processing stations. "You will be evaluated, categorized, and prepared for combat within the cycle. Those deemed suitable will fight. Those deemed unsuitable will be recycled into biomatter for arena maintenance." The casual mention of recycling human beings into compost hit Marcus like a physical blow. He felt his hands clench into fists, felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had kept him alive when Kithra dropships had turned his world into a burning wasteland. "Easy," Elena whispered, placing a hand on his arm. "Save it for the arena." The processing took hours. They were stripped, examined, prodded, and subjected to a battery of tests that measured everything from reflexes to pain tolerance. Marcus found himself in a sterile white chamber facing a holographic display that showed various weapons and combat scenarios. A synthetic voice instructed him to respond to different tactical situations while sensors monitored his biometric responses. "Interesting," commented a new voice. Marcus turned to see something he hadn't encountered before, a being that might have been humanoid if not for the extra arms and the face that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. "Your stress responses indicate significant combat experience, yet your psychological profile suggests deep emotional trauma. Grief-fueled aggression combined with tactical competence. Very marketable." "What are you?" Marcus asked. "I am Synaxi, arena coordinator for combat matches involving mammalian species. Your designation is, let me see, Marcus Chen, age 34, former lieutenant colonel, survivor of the Battle of New Singapore." The creature's face solidified into something approximating sympathy. "You lost family there." Marcus said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "Your daughter, Sarah, age 7, killed when your defense network failed." Synaxi consulted a data pad with one of its lower arms. "The recordings show you attempted to reach the evacuation shuttles. Quite heroic, actually. Futile, but heroic." The rage exploded outward before Marcus could control it. He lunged forward, hands reaching for the alien's throat, but restraint fields activated instantly, holding him suspended in mid-air as electricity coursed through his body. "Yes," Synaxi said with satisfaction. "That passion, that fury, it will serve you well in the arena. The crowds love fighters who carry personal vendetta. It makes the violence more authentic." As the restraint fields released him, Marcus collapsed to his knees, gasping. Through the pain and humiliation, he heard Synaxi continue speaking. "You will be assigned to Pit Complex 7, designed for terrestrial species combat. Your first match is in 3 days against a Jakari war champion who has accumulated 17 victories. The odds are currently running 400 against your survival." "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus managed to gasp out. "Because, Lieutenant Colonel Chen, I have invested considerable resources in acquiring human specimens. Your species represents a new market demographic, and I intend to maximize profit margins. Consider this conversation a performance briefing." The transport to Pit Complex 7 took them through the heart of the station's entertainment district. Through reinforced windows, Marcus watched alien crowds gathering around massive viewing screens that displayed combat highlights from ongoing matches. The footage was horrific. Beings he recognized from the processing center engaged in battles that seemed designed more for spectacle than sporting competition. He watched a Gorlani warrior, its rock-like hide cracked and bleeding, face off against something that looked like a mechanical spider the size of a hover tank. The crowd's reaction was audible even through the transport's hull as the spider machine systematically dismantled its opponent with surgical precision, each severed limb accompanied by cheers from thousands of alien throats. "Jesus Christ," whispered Private Kim, the youngest member of their group. "They're enjoying this." "Of course they are," Elena replied, her voice flat with exhaustion. "We're the exotic specimens now. Humans fighting for their lives while civilized beings place bets and eat snacks." The pit complex turned out to be a labyrinthine structure built into the arena's lower levels. Their quarters were Spartan but clean, individual cells with basic sleeping arrangements and a common area where fighters could interact between matches. The diversity was staggering. Dozens of species from across the galaxy, all united by their status as entertainment for the hegemony's vast population. Marcus found himself assigned to a cell next to a Jakari named Kreshtar, whose crystalline skin bore the scars of countless battles. The alien stood nearly 8 feet tall, its 6 arms ending in claws that could slice through steel, yet when it spoke, its voice carried a strange melancholy. "You are the human specimens," Kreshtar observed in accented standard. "I have heard rumors of your species. They say your kind fought well before the end." "We fought," Marcus replied simply. "As did we all. The hegemony consumes entire civilizations, yet we survive here in this place of death to provide amusement for our conquerors." The Jakari's crystalline features shifted in what might have been a smile. "There is irony in this, yes. We who should be dead continue to exist while our worlds burn." That night, Marcus lay on his narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling. Through the walls, he'd hear the sounds of the arena, the roar of crowds, the clash of weapons, the screams of the dying. Somewhere above them, Sarah's killers were probably placing bets on how long he would last against their entertainment. The rage that had sustained him through 3 months of captivity began to evolve into something colder, more focused. If he was going to die in this place, he would make it cost him something. He would make them remember that humanity had not gone quietly into the night. He closed his eyes and began to plan. Marcus's first match came sooner than expected. A riot in Complex 4 had resulted in several fighter casualties, leaving gaps in the tournament brackets that needed to be filled. He found himself standing in a preparation chamber, surrounded by arena technicians who fitted him with the standard gladiator equipment, light armor that protected vital organs while leaving plenty of exposed flesh for dramatic injury potential, and a selection of weapons that seemed designed more for visual impact than tactical effectiveness. The blade has monomolecular edge, sharp enough to cut through most organic tissue, explained a technician whose species Marcus couldn't identify. The energy shield will deflect 3 direct hits from standard weapons before failure. Combat stimulants are optional but recommended. They increase pain tolerance and reaction time while providing better entertainment value through enhanced aggression. Marcus declined the stimulants. He'd seen what combat drugs did to soldiers during the war, the initial boost followed by inevitable crash that left users vulnerable and disoriented. Better to rely on natural adrenaline and decades of training. The arena itself defied description. As the lift platform carried him up from the pit complex, Marcus emerged into a vast amphitheater that could have held 1 million spectators. The stands rose in tiers that disappeared in the darkness above, filled with alien forms, cheering, hissing, and making sounds he had no reference for. The arena floor was a circular space nearly 1 kilometer in diameter, its surface configured to simulate different environmental conditions for each match. Today's setting was urban warfare, a mock cityscape of ruined buildings and debris-strewn streets that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to New Singapore after the bombardment. Whether this was coincidence or calculated psychological manipulation, Marcus couldn't tell, but the irony wasn't lost on him. His opponent emerged from the opposite platform. The Jakari war champion Synaxi had mentioned, its crystalline skin gleaming under the arena's harsh lighting. Vorthak the Unbroken, according to the announcer whose words echo from speakers throughout the complex. 17 victories, 0 defeats, currently ranked 4th in the arena's overall standings. The champion was magnificent in a terrifying way, nearly 10 feet tall with 6 arms that moved with liquid precision, each ending in claws that had been surgically enhanced with metal edges. Its crystalline skin had been carved with ritualistic scars that created fractal patterns across its surface, and its multifaceted eyes tracked Marcus's movements with predatory intelligence. Human, Vorti spoke in perfect standard, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the crystalline structures on its body. I have studied recordings of your species' final battles. You fight with desperate creativity when faced with extinction. This will be interesting. The arena master's voice boomed across the space. Citizens of the hegemony. Today we witness a historic moment, the first human specimen to enter formal combat in the Nexus Prime arena. Will the legendary endurance of Terra's warriors prove sufficient against the proven might of Vorthak the Unbroken? Place your final wagers now. A countdown timer appeared in the air above them, holographic numbers descending from 10 to 0. Marcus felt time slow as his training took over. Assess the environment, identify cover positions, evaluate opponent capabilities, formulate initial tactical response. The ruined cityscape offered numerous hiding spots and potential ambush points, but also provided his opponent with elevated positions for ranged attacks using debris as projectiles. The horn sounded. Vorthak moved faster than Marcus had anticipated, all 6 arms working in coordination to hurl chunks of concrete with lethal accuracy. Marcus dove behind the collapsed wall segment as projectiles shattered stone around him, his mind racing through tactical options. Direct confrontation would be suicide. The Jakari had reach, strength, and experience advantages that human agility alone couldn't overcome. But humans had something else. Something that had allowed them to survive on a hostile world, long enough to reach the stars, something that had made them effective soldiers despite being outclassed by most alien species in terms of raw physical capability. Humans were persistent predators. They didn't give up. Marcus began to move through the ruins with practiced stealth, using debris and shadows to mask his position while Vorthak searched for him with growing frustration. The alien's crystalline skin made it easy to track. It reflected light in distinctive patterns that gave away its location even when it tried to use cover. The first attack came from above. Marcus had climbed through the skeletal remains of a bombed-out building, positioning himself on what remained of the 3rd floor. As Vorthak passed beneath, Marcus dropped down with his monomolecular blade extended, aiming for the joint where the alien's upper right arm connected to its shoulder. The blade bit deep into crystalline flesh before Vorthak's reflexes kicked in. Forearms grabbed Marcus and hurled him across the arena floor, sending him skidding through debris that tore at his armor. But the damage was done. Alien blood flowed from the wound, and the champion's movements on that side became noticeably restricted. First blood to the human. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, and Marcus heard something he hadn't expected, cheers from portions of the crowd. Apparently, some spectators enjoyed seeing underdogs land successful attacks. Vorthak's response was swift and brutal. The alien began systematically destroying cover positions, using its massive strength to collapse entire building facades that Marcus might use for concealment. The arena floor became a killing ground of falling debris and pulverized concrete. But Marcus had learned something crucial during that first exchange. Vorthak was used to opponents who relied on strength and direct confrontation. The Jakari's tactical thinking was sound but conventional. It expected Marcus to behave like other gladiators, to seek honorable combat rather than whatever advantages he could create. What it didn't expect was for Marcus to weaponize the environment itself. The ruined cityscape included a damaged power distribution node, a piece of arena equipment designed to provide electrical effects for dramatic combat scenarios. As Vorthak pursued him through the debris field, Marcus led the alien directly over the exposed power conduits he'd noticed during his initial reconnaissance. The monomolecular blade sliced through the conduit's protective housing just as Vorthak's weight came down on the exposed high-voltage lines. Electricity coursed through the Jakari's crystalline body, creating a light show that drew gasps from the crowd. The alien's scream resonated through harmonics that made Marcus's teeth ache, but he didn't hesitate. While Vorthak was paralyzed by electrical overload, Marcus closed the distance and drove his blade deep into the champion's primary heart. Vorthak looked down at the weapon protruding from its chest with what seemed like surprise. When it spoke, Its voice was barely a whisper. 17 victories, and I am defeated by trickery. Not trickery, Marcus replied, his own voice hoarse with exhaustion. Adaptation. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything he'd heard since arriving at the arena. Some sections erupted in cheers, others in angry hisses and alien curses. Money had been lost and won on his impossible victory, but more than that, something unprecedented had happened. A gladiator ranked outside the top 1,000 had defeated a champion using tactics none of them had seen before. As medical teams rushed onto the arena floor to tend to Vorthak's injuries, the arena's policy was to preserve valuable fighters whenever possible. Marcus found himself surrounded by hegemony officials who seemed equally amazed and disturbed by what they'd witnessed. Synaxi appeared at his elbow, its mercury-like features flowing with what might have been excitement. Extraordinary! The betting pools are in chaos. No one predicted tactical innovation of this magnitude from a human specimen. Is he going to live? Marcus asked, nodding toward Vorthak. The Jakari possess remarkable regenerative capabilities. He will recover, though his ranking will suffer considerably. You fought with strategies we have not encountered before. Most gladiators rely on strength, speed, or natural weapons. Use the environment itself as an ally. Human soldiers learn to improvise or they die young, Marcus replied. Yes, this creates fascinating marketing opportunities. The human champion, survivor of the species that fought the hegemony to the last soldier, now bringing those same desperate tactics to the arena. Synaxi's form shifted through several emotional configurations. Your next match will be against multiple opponents. The crowd will expect escalation after such an upset victory. Back in the pit complex, Marcus was greeted as a minor celebrity. Fighters from a dozen species approached him with mixtures of curiosity and respect. Even Kreshtar, his Jakari neighbor, seemed intrigued by the tactics he'd employed against Vorthak. You fought without honor, the alien observed, though its tone wasn't accusatory. The human way, I think. Victory through any means necessary. My daughter doesn't care about honor, Marcus replied quietly. She's dead because the hegemony wanted our worlds. If I'm going to die in this place, I'll make them work for it. Dr. Elena Vasquez found him in the common area later that evening, her medical training having earned her a position tending to gladiator injuries rather than fighting herself. The arena masters had discovered that keeping their expensive entertainment assets in peak condition required medical expertise from multiple species. You're becoming famous, she told him, showing him a data pad displaying betting odds and fighter rankings. The networks are calling you the Ghost of New Singapore. Apparently your fighting style reminds them of footage from the siege. Marcus studied the rankings. His victory over Vorthak had catapulted him from unranked to position 847 out of roughly 3,000 active gladiators. It wasn't high, but it was significant enough to attract attention from the arena's corporate sponsors. There's something else, Elena continued. I've been treating fighters from different species, and I'm starting to see patterns. The arena masters don't just want entertainment, they're conducting some kind of research. They monitor everything: biometric data, psychological responses, tactical innovations. It's like they're studying how different species adapt to extreme stress. I don't know. But whatever it is, your performance today just moved you to the top of their list. The next few weeks passed in a blur of increasingly challenging matches. Marcus faced opponents that tested different aspects of his capabilities. A pack of razor-fast Vex hunters that forced him to develop new movement patterns. A Gorlani Titan whose rocky hide required creative solutions for inflicting damage. A technologically enhanced warrior from a machine species that challenged his ability to adapt to completely alien combat paradigms. Each victory came at a cost. Marcus accumulated injuries that Elena patched together between matches, scars that mapped the evolution of his fighting style, from desperate improvisation to calculated innovation. But more than that, he felt himself changing in ways that went beyond the physical. The rage that had sustained him through his first match had evolved into something colder and more focused. He studied his opponents like puzzles to be solved, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses with a detachment that sometimes frightened him. The crowd's reaction to his victories, their cheers when he survived, their gasps when he turned apparent defeat into unexpected triumph, began to matter less than the tactical lessons each battle taught him. He was becoming what the arena wanted, a perfect gladiator. The realization hit him during his 15th match, when he found himself genuinely enjoying the challenge of outmaneuvering an opponent whose species specialized in psychological warfare. The Neef warrior had been using bioluminescent patterns to induce disorientation and fear responses in previous opponents, but Marcus had spent the week before the match studying the creature's patterns and developing countermeasures. When he finally defeated the NYTH by exploiting a blind spot in its visual field, the crowd's reaction was thunderous. But as he stood over his fallen opponent, Marcus realized that for a brief moment, he had forgotten why he was fighting. The tactical puzzle had become more important than the memory of his daughter, the satisfaction of victory more compelling than his desire for revenge. That night, he sat in his cell and forced himself to remember Sarah's face. The sound of her laughter, the way she'd run to greet him when he came home from deployment. The memories felt distant, faded, like photographs left too long in sunlight. He was losing himself in this place, becoming exactly what his captors wanted, a weapon they could aim at any opponent for the amusement of their audience. The thought terrified him more than any gladiator he'd faced. But it also gave him an idea. The idea came to Marcus during his 23rd match as he watched a Vex warrior called /Kryn systematically dismantle a Jakari fighter with clinical precision. Both combatants were skilled, both had dozens of victories to their names, but the match felt hollow somehow, a choreographed dance of death that satisfied the crowd's bloodlust while revealing nothing about the fighters themselves. They were all performing their roles in the arena's grand spectacle, playing parts in a narrative designed by their captors. The brave warrior, the cunning assassin, the unstoppable juggernaut. Each gladiator had been reduced to a stereotype that could be marketed to different demographic segments of the hegemony's vast entertainment audience. But what if someone refused to play their assigned role? What if a gladiator found a way to turn the arena's own systems against itself? Marcus began to study the institution from the inside, using his growing access to arena facilities to observe how the entire operation functioned. As his ranking climbed, he was now positioned at 341 and rising. He gained access to better medical facilities, training equipment, and most importantly, the arena's historical archives. The records told a story that the crowds never saw. Gladiators didn't retire. They died, either in combat or through medical complications when their entertainment value declined. The arena had operated for over 2 centuries, consuming thousands of warriors from hundreds of species, yet no fighter had ever achieved anything beyond temporary fame before inevitable death, except for one. Deep in the archive data, Marcus found reference to a gladiator known only as the Persistence, a fighter from a species called the Andromedans who had competed nearly 50 years ago. Unlike other champions, the Persistence hadn't accumulated victories through superior combat skills or innovative tactics. Instead, this gladiator had simply refused to die. Match after match, the Persistence had survived through pure endurance, outlasting opponents who possessed greater strength, speed, or natural weapons. The fighter had never achieved top rankings, never accumulated the kind of win-loss record that created legendary status, but had competed for an unprecedented 7 years before suddenly disappearing from the records. The file was heavily redacted, but Marcus found hints that the Persistence had done something that forced the arena masters to completely restructure their tournament system. Whatever it was, it had been significant enough to affect arena operations decades later. Dr. Vasquez helped him piece together more information during their clandestine meetings in the medical facility. As the arena's de facto expert on cross-species physiology, she had access to historical medical records that revealed interesting patterns. The Persistence never sustained major injuries, she told him, reviewing data on a secure terminal. Look at these treatment records. Minor cuts, bruises, exhaustion, but nothing that would keep a fighter out of competition for more than a few days. It's like this gladiator found a way to survive without really winning. What happened to him? That's where it gets interesting. The records show the persistence was transferred to private collection, whatever that means. But here's the strange part. 6 months later, the arena implemented new rules about match duration and fighter rest periods. They also established the current ranking system that prevents long-term low-level competition. Marcus studied the data, his mind working through the implications. The persistence had found some way to game the system, to survive without achieving the kind of dominant victories that would eventually pit him against unbeatable opponents. But more than that, his mere existence had forced the arena to change its fundamental operating procedures. Elena, Marcus said quietly, "What if the point isn't to win? What if the point is just to keep existing?" She looked at him with concern. "Marcus, you're starting to sound like someone who's been in this place too long?" "Maybe. But think about it. Every gladiator who becomes a champion eventually faces opponents designed to kill them. The arena needs turnover, needs fresh blood to keep the entertainment fresh. But what if someone simply refused to play that game? You're talking about deliberately losing matches. No, I'm talking about surviving them. There's a difference." Marcus's next match was against a team of 3 Cathera warriors, the same species that had conquered his homeworld. The irony wasn't lost on him as he prepared for battle against humanity's destroyers, but he forced himself to view the situation tactically rather than emotionally. The arena had configured itself as a massive jungle environment, complete with thick vegetation, dangerous wildlife, and weather effects that created both opportunities and hazards. It was the kind of setting that favored the Cathera's natural advantages. Their chitinous armor provided protection against the environment's hazards, while their compound eyes gave them superior vision in low-light conditions. But Marcus wasn't planning to defeat them through conventional means. As the match began, he immediately fled into the deepest part of the jungle, using his knowledge of guerrilla tactics to create a trail that would be difficult but not impossible for the Cathera to follow. His goal wasn't to evade them entirely. That would result in a forfeit, but to control the pace and location of their encounters. The first Cathera warrior found him 6 hours into the match, near a toxic swamp that filled the air with hallucinogenic spores. Marcus allowed himself to be cornered, then led the alien through a running battle that exposed both of them to the swamp's effects. When the warrior finally succumbed to poisoning, Marcus was barely conscious himself, but he had achieved something crucial. A victory that looked accidental rather than tactical. The crowd's reaction was mixed. The match had been long, exhausting, and lacking in spectacular combat moments. But Marcus had survived against impossible odds, and survival was entertainment enough for some segments of the audience. His strategy became clear over the following months. Rather than seeking dominant victories that would rapidly advance his ranking, Marcus engineered matches that showcased human endurance while avoiding the kind of tactical brilliance that had characterized his early fights. He lost almost as often as he won, but he lost in ways that suggested bad luck rather than inferior skill. The arena masters were puzzled but not displeased. Marcus had become a reliable mid-tier fighter who could be counted on to provide entertaining matches without requiring the massive payouts associated with true champions. His ranking stabilized around 400, high enough to attract betting interest but low enough to avoid the kind of marquee matches that would put him against the arena's top killers. But more importantly, he was learning. Each match taught him something new about a different species' capabilities, their strengths and weaknesses, their psychological patterns under stress. He was accumulating knowledge that no human had ever possessed, a comprehensive understanding of how dozens of alien species fought, reacted, and could be defeated. The breakthrough came during his 40th match against a Nightwide TH warrior whose bioluminescent abilities had driven 3 previous opponents insane. As Marcus struggled to maintain his sanity while the alien's skin pulsed with mind-bending patterns, he realized something crucial about his own psychology. The rage that had sustained him through his early matches had evolved into something else, a kind of focused madness that allowed him to function in situations that would break other minds. The loss of his daughter, the destruction of his world, the months of captivity and forced combat, all of it had damaged him in ways that were normally considered catastrophic. But in the arena's environment, psychological damage could be an advantage. The trauma that made it difficult for him to form emotional connections also made him resistant to fear-based attacks. The obsessive focus that had replaced his normal emotional responses allowed him to maintain tactical thinking under extreme stress. The numbness that had settled over his memories of civilian life made it easier to commit the violence necessary for survival. He wasn't just adapting to the arena. He was becoming something the arena had never encountered before. A fighter who had been broken in exactly the right ways to thrive in this environment of constant mortal threat. The realization both terrified and exhilarated him. He was losing his humanity, but he was gaining something else, the ability to outlast opponents who might be stronger, faster, or more skilled, but who lacked his capacity for enduring suffering. Years passed. His body accumulated scars that mapped decades of combat against enemies that defied imagination. He had fought representatives of nearly every species in the hegemony, survived encounters that had killed gladiators with superior physical capabilities, and developed a reputation as a warrior who simply would not die. The crowds had names for him now: the persistent ghost, the enduring human, the last son of Terra. He had become exactly what the Persistence had been 50 years ago, a fixture in the arena who survived through sheer refusal to quit rather than through dominance. But unlike his predecessor, Marcus was planning something more than mere survival. He had identified the pattern that governed arena operations. New species were introduced regularly as the hegemony expanded, their warriors forced into gladiatorial combat until they either died or proved unsuitable for entertainment. Successful fighters were ranked and promoted until they faced opponents designed to kill them, ensuring regular turnover in the gladiator population. The system was sustainable because no species had ever found a way to resist it. Each culture approached the arena according to their own values. Some fought with honor, others with cunning, still others with religious fervor or primal savagery. But all of them accepted the fundamental premise that gladiatorial combat was about victory and defeat. Humans were different. Humans were persistence predators who had evolved to outlast prey that was faster, stronger, and better armed. Humans didn't give up, even when giving up was the rational choice, and Marcus had become the purest expression of that evolutionary inheritance. The plan he formulated took 2 more years to implement. It required careful manipulation of his fight record to maintain his mid-tier ranking while accumulating enough victories to qualify for special tournament events. It required building relationships with gladiators from dozens of species, learning their languages and customs well enough to communicate complex ideas. Most challenging of all, it required him to begin thinking of himself not as Marcus Chen, former lieutenant colonel in the Colonial Defense Forces, but as something entirely new. The opportunity came during the arena's Millennium Games, a special tournament held every 1,000 local days to commemorate the facility's founding. Unlike normal matches, the Millennium Games featured multi-species team competitions, survival challenges, and most importantly, a final event called the Crucible. The Crucible was designed as the ultimate test of gladiatorial skill, a massive battle royale involving the top 100 fighters from across all weight classes and species categories. The last survivor will be declared Millennium Champion and granted the right to challenge the arena's current Supreme Champion for ultimate supremacy. It was also the perfect environment for Marcus to implement his plan. As the Crucible began, 99 of the arena's deadliest fighters entered a vast combat zone configured to test every possible survival skill. The environment shifted randomly between different planetary conditions: Arctic wastelands, volcanic hellscapes, toxic swamps, zero-gravity void spaces, while the combatants eliminated each other through combat that ranged from individual duels to massive melee battles. Marcus began exactly as he had in his first match against Vorthak, by avoiding direct confrontation and using environmental hazards to his advantage. But this time, his goal wasn't simply to survive. He was orchestrating something unprecedented in arena history. As fighters fell around him, Marcus began implementing a strategy he had developed through decades of observation. Instead of eliminating opponents himself, he maneuvered them into positions where they would eliminate each other. Instead of seeking advantageous terrain, he guided battles toward areas where environmental hazards would claim victims. Instead of fighting for dominance, he fought for persistence. Hours passed. The field of 99 fighters dwindled to 50, then 20, then 10. Through it all, Marcus remained. Not through superior combat ability, but through an uncanny talent for being anywhere except where the most dangerous fighting was occurring. The crowd's reaction evolved from excitement to puzzlement to something approaching awe. They were witnessing something that had never happened before in arena history, a gladiator who was winning not by defeating opponents, but by outlasting them. With 5 fighters remaining, Marcus finally revealed the true nature of his plan. Instead of continuing to avoid combat, he began moving with deliberate purpose through the arena's shifting landscape, seeking out his remaining opponents not to fight them, but to communicate with them. The first was Kreshtar, his old neighbor from the pit complex, now bearing the scars of dozens of victories, but still possessing the melancholy wisdom that had marked their early conversations. The Jakari warrior was crouched behind crystalline formations in what had become a frozen wasteland environment, waiting for an opportunity to ambush one of the other survivors. "Old friend," Marcus called out in the Jakari language, his pronunciation still heavily accented after years of practice. "We need to talk." Kreshtar's 6 arms shifted into defensive positions, but his voice carried curiosity rather than hostility. "Human, Marcus. You survived still, though many predicted your death in the first hour. What words do you bring to this place of final battle?" "Words about what comes after," Marcus replied, stepping into view with his weapons lowered. "Have you ever wondered what happens to Millennium Champions?" The question seemed to catch Kreshtar off guard. In all the arena's history, no gladiator had ever been recorded asking about the aftermath of ultimate victory. Champions fought for glory, for the crowd's approval, for the brief moment of triumph before inevitable death in future matches. "They become legend," Kreshtar answered, though his tone suggested uncertainty. "They disappear," Marcus corrected. "Just like the persistence. Just like every fighter who becomes too successful to control. The arena doesn't want champions, it wants entertainment. And entertainment requires turnover." The conversation that followed violated every tradition of gladiatorial combat. Instead of fighting to the death, Marcus and Kresh discussed the mathematics of survival in a system designed to ensure their eventual destruction. They talked about the patterns Marcus had observed over decades of competition, the way promising fighters were systematically eliminated when their popularity threatened the arena's carefully managed ecosystem. By the time the other 3 survivors, a Vex assassin named Silreth, a mechanical warrior from the Construct Collective designated Unit 847, and a massive Gorlani called Stone That Bleeds, had converged on their position, Marcus had laid out his entire theory about the arena's true purpose. "You suggest we refuse to fight," Unit 847's synthetic voice crackled with electronic interference from environmental damage. "This violates all programming parameters for gladiatorial engagement." "I suggest we change the parameters," Marcus replied. "The arena operates on the assumption that we'll destroy each other for their entertainment." "But what if we don't? What if the last 5 survivors of the Millennium Games simply refuse to continue?" Stone That Bleeds, whose rocky hide had been cracked by extreme temperature changes, rumbled with what might have been laughter. "The crowd demands blood, human. They will not accept passive resistance." "The crowd wants a story," Marcus countered. "Give them a better story than mutual destruction. Give them something they've never seen before." The debate that followed lasted hours, conducted in the shadow of arena walls, while millions of spectators watched in growing confusion. Never before had gladiators spent significant time in conversation rather than combat. The betting pools were in chaos as oddsmakers tried to calculate probabilities for scenarios they had never imagined. Silvia, whose scaled skin had been shifting colors with agitation throughout the discussion, finally broke the deadlock. What you propose has never been attempted. The arena masters will intervene. They will force combat through environmental manipulation or direct compulsion. Probably, Marcus agreed. But by then, we'll have demonstrated something important. We'll have shown every gladiator in every pit complex, every slave warrior from every conquered species, that the system only works if we cooperate with our own destruction. The decision, when it came, was unanimous. All 5 survivors laid down their weapons and sat in a circle at the center of the arena floor. No words were spoken, words weren't necessary. They had chosen to exist rather than to fight, to persist rather than to conquer. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything in arena history. Some sections erupted in fury, demanding that the fighters honor their obligation to provide death sport entertainment. Others fell silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. In the VIP sections where arena masters and hegemony officials watched, the response was electric panic as beings who had built their fortunes on predictable violence scrambled to understand what was happening. The environmental controls activated within minutes. The arena floor became a furnace, then a freezing wasteland, then a toxic marsh, then a void space that left the fighters gasping for breath. Each change was designed to force the gladiators into motion, to break their formation and resume normal combat. The 5 survivors endured each assault without moving. When stone that bleeds collapsed from oxygen deprivation during the void space phase, the others carried him. When Silra's cold-blooded physiology began failing during its ice phase, they shared body heat. When Unit 847 systems began shutting down from environmental damage, they shielded the mechanical warrior with their own bodies. They persisted. Hours passed. The crowd's mood shifted from anger to fascination to something approaching reverence. In pit complexes throughout the station, gladiators watched the broadcast and began to understand what was happening above them. For the first time in arena history, fighters were demonstrating that they had agency beyond the violence they had been programmed to provide. The intervention, when it came, was swift and brutal. Security forces flooded the arena floor, Kithera shock troops with weapons designed to incapacitate rather than kill. The arena's investment in these 5 gladiators was too significant to simply eliminate them, but their rebellion had to be ended before it could spread. Marcus felt the neural disruptors hit his nervous system like lightning. As consciousness faded, he saw his companions falling around him, their great act of defiance reduced to unconscious bodies being dragged away by their captors. But in the brief moment before darkness claimed him, he heard something that made it all worthwhile, the sound of silence from a crowd that didn't know how to react to what they had witnessed. The aftermath was everything Marcus had expected and more. The 5 Millennium survivors were transferred to isolation cells in the deepest levels of the arena complex, far from other gladiators who might be infected by their rebellious ideas. They were subjected to intensive interrogation, psychological conditioning, and medical procedures designed to identify what had allowed them to coordinate their resistance. But the damage was already done. Within days of the Millennium Games incident, gladiators throughout the arena began demonstrating new behaviors. Some refused to fight with their traditional intensity, prolonging matches through defensive tactics rather than seeking quick victories. Others began communicating with opponents during combat, sharing tactical information that helped both fighters survive longer. Most significantly, fighters began deliberately avoiding the kind of spectacular victories that would advance their rankings toward dangerous territory. The arena's carefully calibrated system of progressive challenge began to break down as gladiators learned to manage their own careers rather than allowing themselves to be managed by the institution. In his isolation cell, Marcus received periodic updates to Dr. Vasquez, who had somehow managed to maintain her medical access despite the security crackdown. The news she brought was both encouraging and terrifying. "They're calling it the Persistence Protocol," she told him during one of her clandestine visits. "Gladiators are adopting your survival strategies, but they're also developing new ones. There's a Nith warrior who's been using his bioluminescent abilities to communicate with other fighters across species barriers. A group of construct collective units have figured out how to share processing power to enhance each other's tactical capabilities. What about the arena masters? Panic. Profits are down 30% because matches are lasting longer and featuring less dramatic violence. Some of the corporate sponsors are threatening to withdraw funding if they can't guarantee the kind of entertainment value their audiences expect." Marcus smiled grimly. "Good. Let them panic. Let them realize that their entire system depends on our willingness to cooperate with our own destruction." "Marcus," Elena's voice carried a warning tone, "they're talking about terminating the entire Gladiator program, replacing live combat with holographic simulations or mechanized battles. If they can't control the gladiators, this will eliminate gladiators entirely." The possibility had occurred to Marcus, but he had calculated it as an acceptable risk. How many fighters are currently in the system? Nearly 4,000 across all complexes. 4,000 warriors from dozens of species, all trained in combat, all with nothing left to lose. Marcus met her eyes. "Elena, they can't eliminate us. We're not just entertainment anymore, we're a symbol. Every conquered species in the hegemony is watching to see what happens to us. If they massacre 4,000 gladiators for refusing to die on schedule, they'll have a full-scale rebellion on their hands." The stalemate lasted for months. The arena continued to operate, but at reduced capacity and with significantly less profitable matches. The gladiators had learned to walk the line between passive resistance and outright rebellion, providing enough entertainment to justify their continued existence while refusing to participate in the wholesale slaughter that had characterized the institution for centuries. Marcus remained in isolation, but his influence spread through whispered conversations and subtle behavioral changes that rippled through the gladiator community. He had become what he had never intended to be, not just a survivor, but a leader of survivors. The revolution, when it came, began not with violence, but with a simple question posed by a young Jakari fighter during a routine match. "Why are we doing this?" The question was broadcast live to billions of viewers across the hegemony. In the moment of silence that followed, as both the fighter and his opponent stopped mid-combat to consider the implications, every being watching realized that they were witnessing the end of an era. Within hours, matches across all arena complexes had ground to a halt as gladiators chose to ask questions rather than fight battles. The great machine of entertainment that had operated for centuries was paralyzed by the simple act of thinking beings refusing to participate in their own destruction. The final confrontation came in the form of an ultimatum delivered by Synaxi himself, the arena coordinator who had first evaluated Marcus years earlier. Standing before the assembled gladiators in the main arena, surrounded by security forces that could have eliminated them all, the alien delivered the hegemony's final offer. "You will resume normal combat operations," Synaxi announced, its mercurial features flowing through configurations of barely controlled rage. "You'll provide the entertainment for which you were acquired, or you will be terminated and replaced with more cooperative subjects." The response came not from Marcus, who remained in isolation, but from Kreshtar, speaking for the thousands of fighters who had chosen persistence over performance. "We are warriors," the Jakari said simply. "We have always been warriors. But we choose when to fight, and for what cause, and against whom. We no longer choose to fight for your amusement." The massacre that followed was brief and brutal. Security forces opened fire with weapons designed to kill rather than incapacitate, cutting down fighters who had chosen to stand together rather than die alone. In less than an hour, 4,000 of the galaxy's most skilled warriors were reduced to corpses littering the arena floor. But even in death, they had achieved something unprecedented. The images of the massacre, broadcast live to audiences across the hegemony, created exactly the kind of martyrdom that Marcus had predicted. Within days, rebellions erupted on dozens of worlds as conquered populations rose up against their oppressors, inspired by the example of gladiators who had chosen dignity over survival. The hegemony's response was swift and overwhelming, but the damage was irreversible. The institution that had maintained order through carefully managed violence found itself facing system-wide resistance from beings who had learned that death with dignity was preferable to life without hope. In his isolation cell, Marcus heard the sounds of revolution echoing through the arena's corridors. Explosions, weapons, fire, the screams of the dying, all the sounds of his homeworld's final battle. But this time, humanity's lesson in persistence was being taught to an entire galaxy. When the cell door finally opened, he expected to see hegemony guards coming to execute him. Instead, he found Elena Vasquez, her medical uniform replaced by improvised combat gear, a pulse rifle in her hands. "Time to go," she said simply. "The station's been taken by a joint force of escaped gladiators and hegemony resistance cells. Apparently, your little demonstration inspired more than just arena fighters." As they made their way through corridors filled with the sounds of ongoing battle, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since watching Sarah's school explode. Hope. Not for himself, but for the idea that beings could choose their own fate rather than accepting the roles assigned to them by their conquerors. "What happens now?" he asked as they reached an evacuation shuttle where other survivors were gathering. "Now we find out if persistence is enough," Elena replied. "The hegemony still controls most of the galaxy. They still have vast fleets and planetary defense systems, but they've lost something they can never get back: the belief that their subjects will submit indefinitely to oppression." The shuttle lifted off from the dying arena, carrying Marcus and the other survivors toward an uncertain future. Behind them, the great machine of entertainment that had consumed countless lives finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Marcus pressed his face to the viewport and watched the Nexus Prime Arena fade into the darkness of space. Somewhere in that darkness, Sarah's memory waited for him. Not the faded ghost that had sustained him through years of captivity, but the bright reality of a child who had believed her father could protect her from anything. He had failed to save her world. He had failed to save her life. But he had succeeded in teaching the galaxy something that might save countless other children from suffering the same fate. Humans weren't the biggest or the strongest or the fastest species in the galaxy, but they were the last ones standing, and sometimes that was enough. 10 years after the fall of the Nexus Prime Arena, Marcus Chen stood on the observation deck of the free ship New Singapore, watching a liberation fleet prepare for the final assault on the hegemony's capital system. Around him, beings from dozens of species worked together with the kind of coordination that would have been impossible before the Gladiator Rebellion taught them that survival was a collaborative art. The war was almost over. The hegemony's military might had proved insufficient against an enemy that refused to be destroyed, that absorbed casualties and kept fighting, that learned from every defeat and applied those lessons to the next battle. They had learned humanity's greatest lesson, that persistence could overcome any advantage if applied with sufficient patience and determination. "The final assault begins in 1 hour," reported Commander Kreshtar, his crystalline skin bearing new scars from a decade of revolutionary warfare. The former gladiator had become one of the rebellion's most effective strategic leaders, his combat experience translating naturally to military command. Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on the small holographic image he held in his hands, a picture of Sarah. Smilingly, she showed off a drawing she had made for him during his last leave before the war. The image was a reconstruction based on his memories, created by alien technology that could translate neurological patterns into visual data. "She would have been 17 now," he said quietly. "She would have been proud," Kreshtar replied. "The human who taught the galaxy that survival is a choice, not a circumstance." The final battle, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The hegemony's capital world surrendered after a brief engagement that demonstrated the futility of resistance against an enemy that had learned to absorb any amount of punishment and continue fighting. The great empire that had conquered countless civilizations fell not to superior technology or overwhelming force, but to the simple refusal of its subjects to accept their assigned roles. In the aftermath, as liberation forces secured hegemony installations and freed the last populations of slave workers, Marcus found himself in the ruins of a facility that had once coordinated gladiatorial games across the galaxy. The records contained there told the complete story of the arena system. Hundreds of facilities, millions of fighters, centuries of systematic brutality designed to transform warfare into entertainment. All of it ended because one human had learned to endure rather than to conquer. The memorial they built was simple. A wall of stone bearing the names of every gladiator who had died in arena combat, with a single inscription in the common script of all member species. They persisted so that others might be free. Marcus often visited the memorial in the years that followed, as the galaxy slowly rebuilt itself into something that honored the dignity of all sentient beings, rather than the entertainment preferences of the strong. He would stand before Sarah's name, added not because she had been a gladiator, but because her death had created the circumstances that led to the galaxy's liberation, and remembered the lesson she had taught him without ever speaking it aloud. Love was the ultimate form of persistence. It endured beyond death, beyond hope, beyond reason. It was the force that transformed suffering into purpose, defeat into determination, individual survival into collective salvation. Humans weren't the biggest species in the galaxy. They weren't the strongest, or the fastest, or the most technologically advanced. But they were the last ones standing, and in the end that had been enough to change everything. The war was over. The arena was dead. The galaxy was free. And somewhere in the quantum foam that connected all conscious beings across space and time, a 7-year-old girl named Sarah Chen smiled at the father who had finally learned to protect not just her memory, but the future she would never see.